All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to part two, typical applications for two-lane, two-way roadways in our Introduction to the Minnesota Temporary Traffic Control Field Manual for Highway Workers webinar series. I want to welcome you once again, and let's welcome our instructor. So John Jackals works at SRF Consulting Group and has more than 40 years of ITS and traffic engineering experience. He's actively involved in local, regional, and national associations, including the Minnesota County Engineering Association's Traffic Safety Committee, the American Traffic Safety Services Association, the Institute of Traffic Engineers, and the FHWA's Enterprise Pooled Fund Study. John has presented at numerous conferences and served on many technical committees for research and project development. So for this webinar, I want to remind you that this is worth 0.25 Rhodes Scholar Program Maintenance Certificate credits for each of our webinars. You will receive an email after this prompting you to send an email to me letting me know if you would like credit for this, so you can look forward to that. And then I will turn it over to John to get us started today.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. We'll move forward with this. I've got a lot of ground to cover. I encourage everyone to put in questions on the question and answer part of this webinar. And Samantha can monitor those for me and interrupt me at any time. So anytime you have a question, let me know and I will try to answer it. I just want to emphasize this workshop is presented by Minnesota's Local Road Technical Assistance Program from the University of Minnesota and supported by Federal Highway, moving that forward. So we have a lot of sponsors here, including MnDOT. I want to point out something on the field manual. If you have a field manual in front of you, that the web address on the cover is incorrect. The web address on this slide is a correct one. To get that, the entire field manual can be downloaded using that address, or you can order them from the Minnesota Department of Transportation at $5 per manual plus shipping and handling. So field manuals are available for your use. I do want to note that this webinar is not a substitute for, but an introduction to the instructor-led classroom training that's under development right now, where students can be engaged using the field manual and demonstrating solutions to applications that apply to your agency and your work and every day. Must be stressed that not all situations can be addressed at all times, and that training is not a substitute for actual field experience. This is part two on two-lane, two-way roadways. As you can see, there's other parts coming up. Part one was last week, and we have one a week coming up in the future. So if you're interested in multi-lane roads, miscellaneous layouts, and a flagging overview, they're coming in the near future. And must be emphasized that this session is being recorded, so it will be available on the University LTAP website for you to review at any time. As Samantha mentioned, it's required for anyone that wants to receive the Rhodes Scholar certificate for this training. I will be covering basic provisions and standards of temporary traffic control, commonly called work zone traffic control for two-lane, two-way roadways, including low-volume roadways, gravel roadways, continuous two-way left turn lanes, and single-lane roundabouts. Before getting started, it's important to review the MnDOT creed that's included in the field manual. Always remember that no job is so important in maintenance or construction, and no service so urgent that we cannot take time to perform our work safely. Whenever you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, please bring this to the attention of your manager or supervisor. Remember, the goal is that everyone, workers, motorists, bicycle riders, and pedestrians, arrive safely at their destinations. The Minnesota Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways has been established to provide a uniform policy for all traffic control devices on all public streets, roads, and highways within the state of Minnesota. The manual is prepared in pursuant to authority vested by state legislature in Minnesota statute section 16906. That's very unique. The manual is the only standard that's called out in law. Standards prescribed within this manual may also be used by private agencies on facilities which they control. It is recommended that such be done so that the meaning of traffic control devices are uniform throughout the state.
Hey, John,
The
we had a
field
quick
man,
question.
yes.
Is there an updated version of the manual coming out soon?
Yes, there is. The manual is in substantial compliance to the federal manual. The federal manual was just revised and put out in the end of December. The state of Minnesota has 2 years to adopt a new Minnesota manual that's in substantial compliance, and they're working on that right now. So I would expect that basically 2 years from now, we will see a new Minnesota manual, including a new field manual. It must be remembered the goal of temporary traffic control is to provide for the safe and efficient movement of traffic around a location where the normal function of the roadway is temporarily suspended. To accomplish this, the respect of the driver must be earned by appropriate and prudent use of traffic control devices. When work is not in progress or the hazard no longer exists, the temporary traffic control shall be covered, turned away from traffic, or removed from the area. Very important to earn the driver's respect. Equipment temporary traffic control devices was highlighted in part 1. And if you missed that, you can go back and look at that recording and see that, including high visibility clothing, vehicle warning lights, channelizing devices, signing, arrow boards, and portable changeable message signs. As a review, the field manual is divided primarily by roadway type. So first you must determine the type of roadway that the workspace will be located on. Low volume roads are all 2-lane roads with an average daily traffic of 400 vehicles or less in both urban and rural areas. Other key sections are 2-lane, 2-way roadways, which we will be covering this morning, 2-way continuous left turn lane, multi-lane undivided roadways, which will be in part 3, and multi-lane divided roadways also in part 3 of this series. If you have a field manual, you can follow along with me this morning. Turn to the low volume section, which is the second tab going down the side of the pages here. Low volume section was new in the 2018 version, and I think it's been very useful for local agencies to use. After that, we'll determine where the work will take place on the road or on the roadside. And then what is the maintenance activity? What are you doing, patching or sweeping the roadway? How long will the work be in place, which is really key. Mobile operations, short duration and short-term operations will be discussed this morning. In the low volume section, there are 2 ways to determine which layout you use in the indexes. As I mentioned, the first is the type of roadway. Determining the volume, and in this section is low volume roads, which defined as less than 400 vehicles per day. The type of the workspace, where the work is being done, and the duration of the workspace. As I mentioned, mobile 15 minutes or less, short duration of 1 hour or less, short term 12 hours or less, or intermediate term up to 3 days. Long-term traffic controls are not included in the field manual and often need a temporary traffic control plan for that specific project. Note that there's another selection table in the low volume section on urban streets and rural roadways, less than 400 vehicles per day, based on the maintenance activity. So if that's easier to use to look up the layouts, that's a good use for you. Let's look at all the layouts in the low volume section. Layout 1 was developed primarily for local agencies. Read all of the notes. Look at the red boxes first on any of these layouts. This layout is for 30 miles per hour or less, And those are posted speed limits. When we talk about speed limits for work zones, we're talking about what are the posted limits. If it's not posted, you should use a statutory limit of 30 miles per hour for urban and 55 miles an hour for rural. If your city has a lower speed limit than 30 miles per hour, this adds an additional level of safety. Spacing of channelizers are shown at 25 feet, which is the G spacing on the tables we'll talk about later this morning. All the layouts in the low volume section have the dimensions shown on the layouts for ease of use. In layout 2, again, remember to read all the notes, especially the red boxes, and I'll quit reminding everyone of that here as we move forward. This layout has sign and device spacing chart on the layout. Note that drivable surface is a minimum of 10 feet wide unless approved by the local agency. Parking should not be permitted along this area. You need to remember that shall is a mandatory condition when you read the notes that say shall, and should is a recommended condition for the layouts. All layouts show adding cones in the center line to keep traffic channelized in the correct lane. And note 3 states that the keep right sign may be omitted on 40 miles per hour or less roadways. Also, it's important to recall that all advanced warning signs should be visible for at least a decision sight distance to ensure drivers can detect a change, in this case, a work zone, recognize a potential threat, select an appropriate speed and path, and safely complete the maneuver. We'll talk more about decision sight distance in a few minutes. Layout 3 is a closure in the center of an intersection, which would likely be used for sewer and water work. Minimal traffic control is needed because the speed limit for this is 30 miles per hour or less. If the traffic cannot safely go around the workspace, it may be necessary to close the intersection and detour traffic. For layout 4, required good sight distance from both directions. There's a single flagger, and that flagger must be able to see oncoming traffic beyond the workspace. If the workspace is left up at night, there's layout 14, which we'll look at in a bit with using stop signs. The final layout in the low volume section is layout 5, and it's intended for special events such as parades or other community events where roads are completely closed to traffic. It needs to be remembered to check with the local road authority of the roadway that you're closing, because they may have requirements such as signing an official detour or requiring the use of law enforcement to keep vehicles from entering the area. It's important that these barricades span the entire width of the roadway to prohibit vehicles entering the space. Also, it's important to note that all signs, barricades, drums, weighted channelizers, and vertical panels shall be retroreflectorized. Cones and tubes shall be retroreflectorized if used at night. Painted barricades do not meet this requirement. Note, this type of road closure does not meet the requirement of restricting all vehicles and completely closing the roadway as shown in the previous layout. Let's take a moment just to check with what we've covered today. Which of the following are true for low volume roads? Having less than 400 vehicles per day. There are high-speed roadways included there. It's not just urban areas. Low volume roads typically use less traffic control, and that is true. That's why the layouts were developed. The traffic control meets the needs of those roadway segments. Now let's look at other two-lane, two-way roadway layouts for all traffic volumes, including those over 400 vehicles per day. These can be found in the 3rd section of the field manual. Note, many of these layouts are called out in the indexes on the low volume section of the manual, and those layouts are used for low volume roadways also. Before looking at the particular layouts, let's take a look at the distance charts and tables. Most of the layouts use variables for distances, allowing them to be used for multiple speed roadways. Main charts and tables are spacing for stationary work zones, traffic control distance charts, components of mobile work zones, and roll-ahead distance charts for mobile work zones. Let's take a quick look so you become familiar with the charts. You need to determine the appropriate device spacing for channelizers. This is shown in the temporary traffic control distance charts. Next, we need to know how far apart the cones will be in the taper, which is G. For low speed is 25 feet, for high speed is 50 feet spacing. Along the tangent in the work zone, it uses 2G or twice of those distances. Once the crews determine the best layout to use, they'll have to determine the placement of the advanced warning signs, message boards and arrow boards if needed, barricades and channelizers. That information is found in the distance charts on the back cover of the field manual. We'll start with the components of the work zone, stationary work zone. So let's remember to set up the devices in the orders that drivers will see them. If you're closing the right lane on a 55-mile-an-hour road, the first advanced warning sign is road work ahead, then right lane closed, then the transitions or chimney sign. There's an A space between each sign for advanced warning. So at 55 miles an hour, what would be the distance between each sign? As shown in this table is 750 feet. What is a minimum distance from the beginning of the taper to the road work ahead sign would be 3 times 750 or 2,250 feet. Remember, these distances may need to be adjusted for intersections, driveway, curves, hills, and other conditions. Typically, you increase those distances to provide additional time for drivers to react. On two-way roadways, taper is not shown in the table since it's always the same and is not based on the speed of the roadway. Two-way traffic tapers are always 50 feet using 5 equally spaced cones. Notice there's the 3 along each one, and that's shown in note number 3 of the layout, showing that. The next area we need to build into any work zone is the buffer space. This area should be left completely empty so that if the vehicle gets behind the cones through the taper, they have time to stop before hitting anything inside the work zone. In some instances, such as on city streets, there just isn't enough room to build in a full buffer space. So in those cases, the buffer space is optional, but whenever there's enough room to build a buffer, it's for everybody's safety. As you look through the layouts in the manual, you see various letter designations such as A, G, L, and you won't see the letter D on any of the layouts for decision site distance. That's because the distance varies at every location. Let's talk a little bit about decision site distance. It's defined as the total distance traveled during the length of time required for a driver to 1, detect an unexpected or otherwise difficult to perceive information source or hazard, such as a work zone. Recognize that hazard or its potential threat, select an appropriate speed and path, and initiate and complete the required maneuver safely and efficiently. In the field manual, the decision site distance is used to determine the minimum distance required for a driver to see a flagger, as a flagger is located in a vulnerable location, or work areas and layouts with minimal signing. It is also used to determine if an operation qualifies as mobile. The required decision site distances are included in the charts. We want to make sure that the flagger's in a highly visible location. I like this photograph. If we could get it from further back, you see that you could see that flagger for a long ways here. And you also see the buffer space that if somebody doesn't stop for the flagger and gets through the cones, there's room for them to safely stop before getting to the work crew. Also using decision sight distance that's in the tables, you ask the question, am I visible from a great enough distance so drivers have time to respond? And in this case, moving the taper before the curve so drivers can see that from a greater distance, hopefully at least a decision sight distance. Let's take a look at an example of a two flagger setup to determine the location of all the traffic control devices. First is to read all of the notes for that layout. The approach sight distance of the flagger should be at least a decision sight distance D that's shown in the tables. The one-lane road ahead sign may be omitted for roadways that are posted 40 miles per hour or less. Two-way tapers 50 feet in length, as previously talked about. And there's also a layout for a pilot car in layout 18 if you have other needs. Let's recall from part one of this training that devices are installed in the order at which drivers will see them. That makes it necessary to determine the location of the first sign from both directions. For this example, we will assume a posted speed limit of 55 miles an hour and that there's no sight restrictions requiring adjustment of the device locations. Let's begin by looking at the temporary traffic control distance charts. For this example, you need to know the length of the buffer space, 500 feet at 55 miles an hour. Next, you need to know the advanced warning sign spacing, 750 feet at 55 miles an hour. Using this information, we will add the 500-foot buffer space, the 50-foot taper, and for this direction, 4 sign spacings of 750 feet to get a total of 3,550 feet from the workspace to the first work zone sign. For the other direction, we use the 50-foot taper, a 100-foot space that's shown after the end of the termination taper, plus 4 sign spacings, of 750 feet for a total of 3,150 feet. A special note, the two-way taper in the termination area is required for all two-lane two-way roadways to ensure drivers do not enter the workspace. It's also a 100-foot space that provides for larger vehicles to return to their lane at the end of the work zone. For this example, we assume that there were no sight restrictions requiring adjustment of device locations, so these devices will work. In many cases, you'll have to adjust the locations accounting for intersections, driveway, curves, hills, and other field conditions. Typically, you would increase sign spacing while making these adjustments and reduce channelizer spacing to better define the vehicle path. There are many ways to measure to determine distances needed, and a readily available system is to count the broken line or skip pavement markings. In Minnesota, these are all at 50-foot cycle, so counting 15 skips would give you 750-foot sign spacing. As always, you install the temporary traffic control devices in the order which drivers see them and remove them in the reverse order. Details and variations are included in the field manual and were covered in part 1 of this webinar series. Let's take a look at the components for a mobile work zone. The decision sight distance comes into play here. The operation must move down the road at least a decision sight distance in 15 minutes to qualify as mobile. As with stationary work zones, we're going to set this up in the order which drivers will see the trucks. So the first shadow vehicle follows the vehicle at a distance of F that's shown in that table. This distance is based on both the shadow vehicle and the protection truck follow at R, or the roll ahead distance. The roll ahead distance is based on the weight of the host vehicle, and you see 2 different weights for host vehicles. That these trucks will roll forward if they're hit by moving traffic. Please note the instruction behind the chart that shadow on protection vehicle wheels should be pointed straight ahead. Another example for mobile traffic control at 30 miles an hour, it's 100-foot spacing for advanced warning signs. And the advanced warning matches that. Got my box in the wrong place, I'm sorry. Don't forget about buffer spaces. If you'd like to leave a buffer space for vehicles before they get there. And then the roll ahead distances that are based on the weight of the vehicle. And keep the wheels pointed straight ahead, because if you turn your wheels, your truck will go in that direction if it is hit. Let's take a minute to review some of this. Decision sight distance is used to determine if an operation qualifies as mobile, minimum distance required for the driver to see a flagger, and the minimum distance for drivers to respond to a work zone. All of these are true. All work zones require a buffer space. True or false? False. It's not always necessary or possible to get a buffer space, but it's suggested that they be used whenever possible. Two-way traffic tapers are 100 feet long, and that's false. All two-way traffic tapers are 50 feet long. Let's look at the indexes, the index that's in the two-way section. There are two different ADT ranges, or average daily traffic ranges. One is intermediate, up to 1,500 vehicles per day, and the other one is for all the volumes of traffic. They also show the location of the work, and the table shows the duration of the work. I'm going to show all layouts in this section. However, we don't have time to cover the details for each of the layout and only highlight some of the major items. If you have a specific question, please type it in the Q&A and we can discuss your concern. Let's start with layout 6. This is for the work vehicle parked on the shoulder for 1 hour or less. Park the vehicle as far off the roadway as possible and turn on the required 360-degree beacon. If you cross the road, be especially cautious to tell drivers, because we tell drivers to move over for maintenance vehicles. Also, you should always keep your vehicle tires pointed straight ahead in case it is hit. The vehicle will go in the direction the tires are pointing. It's important to note that the manual on uniform traffic control devices defines any work within 15 feet of a traffic lane as a work zone. Layout 7 is required for trailer-mounted devices such as portable signals, flashing arrow boards, and portable changeable message signs. Type B channelizing devices are required to mark these devices. The trailer should be placed at least 4 feet from the edge of the lane. If not, the taper must be doubled the distances shown on the table. In layout 8, shoulder and parking lane closure layouts have been combined. If working in a parking lane, advanced no parking signs may be needed as directed by the local agency and law enforcement. If using for a parking lane closure in a high volume area, you may have to tighten up the channelizing devices to reduce the spacing from 2G to G to discourage parking. Layout 9 is a shoulder closure layout. Note that this is for a short duration closure of 1 hour or less to complete the work. The shadow vehicle, totally or partially in the lane, should be equipped with a TMA. The arrow board on the work vehicle is optional. For layout 10 is a mobile operation for work off of the roadway. And note again that that's for 15 minutes or less before moving on. Layout 11 is for roadways with less than 1,500 vehicles per day, intermediate volume, and for 15 minutes or less. Remember that spotters, if you use a spotter, spotter's only duty is to watch for traffic and warn other workers. The spotter is not a traffic flagger. Layout 12 is for a lane closure for 15 minutes or less, a mobile operation on a two-lane, two-way road. And if you don't have a good decision sight distance, use layout 13. Layout for 13 requires setting advanced warning signs and moving those advanced warning signs. Typical rule of thumb is that when you have a flagger ahead sign, you should not be more than 1 mile beyond that flagger ahead sign with the flagger. Drivers will lose concentration and forget that the flagger's there, or say, oh, they left the sign up again. That's why it's important to take signs down. Again, the downstream flagger has to move with the operation and maintain that 100-foot distance from the front of the work vehicle to allow vehicles to get back into their normal lane. For both of these layouts, note that adequate sight distance is required for both of them. We talked about using layout 14 when you have a longer term project. And again, note that it's for roadways less than 1,500 ADT for both of these situations. For layout 16, all flagging layouts show that a minimum 100 feet. I keep repeating that because it's very important to keep that space open, especially for larger commercial vehicles. I locked up. Let's test knowledge again. Some operations have more than one layout to consider. And that is absolutely true. A lot of these layouts have multiple uses. You have to fit it based, and that's why I keep saying read the notes. Which of the following are true? Some layouts have speed restrictions, traffic volume restrictions, and time limits. Be very careful when looking at the layout. Some have 15 minutes or less, some have 1 hour, some have 12 hours, some have 3 days. Termination taper is optional on two-lane, two-way roadways. That is false. When you get to the end of that workspace, you need that 50-foot taper to ensure that drivers don't enter the work zone from that direction. Layout 17 was developed to make it a little bit easier to have advanced warning signs with a moving operation. So you will notice this is 12 hours or less to conduct this work. And workers don't have to reset all of the signs as they advance down the roadway. They can put them out ahead of time and set them up and move them as they move down the roadway. Use of this layout allows the work to cover 3 miles before the advanced warning signs need to be relocated. The table shows the 3 different time periods in which signs are displayed. For example, in time period 1, you have sign C and sign A displayed. As you move forward to time period 2, you relocate sign A from facing, in this case, southbound to facing the northbound traffic and continue up the roadway. Layout 18 needs a space at both ends for the pilot car to turn around. It's a pilot car operation. You need to make sure you have a space at the end for the pilot car to safely turn around. And pilot car can keep the queue in tight formation if visibility is poor through the work zone. Use of a pilot car helps to control traffic speed through the work zone. It allows for elimination of channelizers along the workspace, especially for a longer workspace, unless there are edge drop-offs. We talked about in part 1, the edge drop-off guidelines that are there. If you have a drop-off greater than 2 inches, you still have to channelize that area. It's especially useful for longer work zones to have a pilot car to control that vehicle speed and to lead traffic through. It's important we look at layout 19 for the longer work zones and special enhancements. Layout 19, note 2 provides instructions to the flaggers at intermediate intersections. You will notice that at lower volume local access road, rather than having a flagger there, there's a special sign, turning traffic, follow pilot car, and instructing them that there might be up to a 10-minute wait for that pilot car to come by. Note 3 provides guidance for flaggers at locations where there are site conditions requiring some additional direction along with the pilot car. Channelizers are needed at flagger stations and near intersections. Tangent channelizers are optional with pilot car operations if the drop-off is 4 inches or less. Layout 20 is for a lane closure on a minor road before an intersection on a major road. Very specific requirements on this layout. The correct location of the flagger where there's turn lanes, the flagger must stand at the beginning of the turn lane to ensure that they're directing all the traffic that's approaching. If you stand inside that turn lane, people won't understand that they're supposed to all stop at your direction. A fourth flagger was added to this layout on the downstream side of the major roadway intersection because it's down to one lane of traffic and two-direction traffic there. When the traffic volume on the minor roadway exceeds 1,500 vehicles per day or turning movements cause unsafe operations, the following steps should be considered. Control traffic at the intersection with the law enforcement officer. Restrict vehicle turns from the major roadway when flagging and signing or closing the turn lanes. And completely close a leg of the minor roadway until the workspace has left the area and detour that traffic. Layout 21 is similar, except there's room beyond the intersection to store vehicles, reducing the number of flaggers to 3. Again, please note, read all of these notes to see which one applies to your situation and which one fits best. And I also will note that sometimes special traffic control plans are needed to be developed where the field manual doesn't quite fit the situation. Layout 22 is when you have a lane closure near railroad grade crossings. Allow enough time for this when planning this work to coordinate with the railroad. Notify the railroad you'll be working in that area. And also note channelizing devices shall not be placed within 8 feet of either side of the tracks. And when you're working on the railroad right away, there may be special conditions with the railroad that you have to coordinate with. Also note in this layout, it shows that the workspace goes across the railroad tracks, or at least the traffic controls do. You also have to be careful if you have a closure that's near a railroad crossing where you anticipate that queuing of traffic will cross over the tracks. That take care on that one. Either don't allow that queuing to happen or notify the railroad, or do as this layout shows, close the roadway before the railroad crossing. The railroad may require that they provide a flagger at that location for vehicles that cross the railroad. Be aware of that. Layout 23 includes some options for flagger stations. We'll cover this in more detail in part 5 of this webinar series when we talk about flagging. Flaggers could use an air horn or an enhanced flagger paddle to draw additional attention to the flaggers themselves. The flagger head sign may be enhanced with conspicuity lighting. The centerline channelization aids in keeping traffic in their lane as they approach the flagging station. And portable rumble strips can be used to alert distracted drivers that they are approaching a flagging station. Layout 24 is for automated flagging assist devices, or AFADs. They are operated by flaggers, but the flaggers are not on or near the roadway. They're located away from moving traffic to enhance their safety. And in some situations, a single operator can be used as long as that operator can be located so they can see the traffic approaching from both directions and see down the roadway in both directions. There are two major types of AFADs that are allowed in Minnesota. One is a stop slow paddle AFAD, as shown on the left, and the other is a 2-segment signal light. Note that both of those have gate arms to control traffic. Another option that's becoming very popular for 2-lane, 2-way roads with 1 lane of traffic open for both directions, portable traffic signals. They eliminate the need for flaggers entirely to control 2-way of traffic on a single lane. The tapers, however, are not 2-way traffic tapers. They are shifting tapers with a length of L/2. So if you look at the table, you'll see that it's a half-length taper. 100-foot tapers on the shoulder that are needed to delineate the signal trailer as shown in previous layout. Layouts 26 and 27 were developed for survey operations, something that goes relatively quick. You will note that it's 1 hour or less to complete this work. It's minimal traffic control. It's only to be used on roadways with less than 1,500 vehicles per day. Layout 28 is when you're working in the center of a roadway. And note that parking or stopping along the work area should not be permitted. This may require advanced posting of no parking by the local road authority and law enforcement, so you don't have vehicles parked there. Typically, I discourage this type of operation on higher speed roadways because there's no escape route for the workers when they're in the center if something goes wrong. You have to cross traffic to get out of that workspace, regardless of which way you go. Another option, instead of using flaggers, is that workspace occupies 1 lane, but you can use the other side of the road where you have enough space to carry 2 lanes of traffic. One direction large arrow is allowed only at shifting tapers. You notice those are shifting tapers again. Double reverse curve sign is needed if the tangent, the workspace is less than 600 feet. When temporary lane widths are less than the existing widths, lanes narrow assembly or a narrow lane assembly should be looked at. And the shoulder taper is required where there is a shoulder. Layout 30 is for gravel road maintenance and grading operations. Read all of these notes and conditions. The road work ahead signs may be omitted where there's adequate sight distance. And when used, it should not be more than 3 miles from the work vehicle. Always remember that the slow moving vehicle sign is required. Flags on the motor grader and beacons on the motor grader help with that visibility. Layout 31 is temporary roadway closure, and you notice at the bottom it's 12 hours or less to set up that traffic control. But be careful because the time limit for stopping vehicles is 15 minutes. So you have to open up that roadway. So this is used temporarily for running wires across a roadway, putting in an overhead bridge or something of that nature where things can be done in 15 minutes or less. Also note that if the volume is less than 400 vehicles per day, law enforcement may be used to control traffic without the need for the advanced signing. Layout 32 is for road closures on a 2-lane, 2-way roadway. Note that the closure is safe and drivable road surface must be maintained up to the point where the roadway is closed. Road closure barricades can be placed on the center line. Make sure that the stripes are slanted in the proper direction of traffic flow. From part 1, you recall traffic in this case, the road closure barricade where it says road closed through traffic passes to the left of that barricade. Note that the road closure barricades, the diagonals point to the center. That means that you should not drive around those barricades, and they should completely close the roadway. In this case, it is completely closed. Layout 33. Excuse me, sorry about that. For closing the left turn lanes and restricting the turns using regulatory signs. May need authorization from the local road authority to do that. Layout 34 shows a 4-lane undivided roadway, but it's in the 2-lane, 2-way section. It can be used for either that, a 2-lane roadway or a 4-lane roadway. Again, there's turn restriction signing required here to keep people from turning. Layout 35 is for crossroad training for longer term work zones where you warn people that they're coming up to a work zone on the crossroad signing. There's a lot of signing required. When you have conditions within that work zone, in this case, low shoulders, they're repeated throughout the work zone to continually warn drivers. Also, as noted in number 5, if you have raised structures such as a manhole cover, etc., consider delineating those so that motorists don't hit them. Let's take a break and talk a little bit about what we've talked about. What are the 3 key pieces of information needed to determine which layout? Type of roadway, location of the work, and the duration of the work. All types of roads require the same type of traffic control. That's false. It is not possible for more than one layout to work in a certain situation. That's false. A lot of times you will see several different layouts that may work for you. That's why I keep stressing, read all the notes, make sure you understand all the conditions that are there, and pick the one that works best for you and your agency. Let's now take a look at two-way continuous left turn lanes. And we're just going to look at the 3-lane sections in this section. We'll talk about the 5-lane sections in the next webinar series. If you look at the index, there's just a few layouts in this section. 2-way continuous turn lane in a 3-lane section, layouts 36, 37, and 38. Take a look at layout 36. It's for 1 hour or less. Notice that a lot of the traffic control is provided by vehicles. And layout 37 is for the same situation for up to 3 days. Again, restrictions on turning may be needed. An option that you have with this roadway is, again, similar to the previous example, where you can still maintain 2-way traffic in that section while working in one of the lanes by shifting traffic over into that left turn lane. Again, you might want to consider using restricted turns through that area so people aren't turning in through your workspace or across a lane of traffic. Let's talk a little bit about single lane roundabouts. They're becoming more popular throughout the state of Minnesota, and these are actually included in the miscellaneous section of the manual. And all of the roundabouts are very unique, and temporary traffic control must meet the site-specific conditions. It's very critical to understand that. A detour might be preferred to this operation, depending on the work that's happening inside that roundabout. And the approach signs are only shown here in one direction, but they're the same for all directions. Careful to read that. And I state a lot of times you may need to have a special temporary traffic control plan to work in these roundabouts, unless you have a detour established and move them away. As you notice, it takes 4 flaggers. They need to coordinate very well. You're directing traffic to go basically the wrong way through that roundabout, which might be difficult depending on the splitter island designs. For instance, if you're going northbound here and someone wants to turn left, that splitter island might be very tough for a vehicle to make that left turn at that location. So it's not a very simple thing to do this. And I think as we get into working in roundabouts more often, we're going to see a lot more guidance developed for how to do that for short-term operations. And that concludes my topics for today. Sam, do we have any additional questions that have been posted?
No questions in the Q&A.
Okay, so next week we have multi-lane roadways, which will be both divided and undivided, and go through that for you if you're interested in those types of roadways. I'll wrap up by saying this is being recorded, so you can refer back to that. We are working on developing classroom training for people that will be available here in the near future. That really helps out to really focus on what you need to do. So a little advertisement for future training that's coming up in this area. And I wish everyone that's working on the highway a very successful and safe summer. And if you have any questions, do not be afraid to reach out to professionals to assist with your traffic control needs. Thank you very much.